Hello again. You're here. You've done enough today. And now all that's left is to fall asleep. But you don't need to chase it. You don't need to think your way into sleep. In fact, the best way is not to try at all. Just listen. Let your eyes feel heavy, even if they're still open. Let your breathing start to follow the pace of the story. Slow, soft, gentle. There's nothing important in the next few minutes. No urgency, no noise. Just quiet storytelling made not to entertain you, but to slow you down. Word by word, breath by breath, till you drift off. And tonight, we're going somewhere ancient. But we're not going to see kings, not golden masks. It's not wars or gods or curses. No, tonight's story isn't about pyramids. It's about a man who lived in their shadow, literally. Long ago, in the heart of ancient Egypt, there lived a man. He was not a pharaoh, not a priest, not even a well-known artist. He didn't carve statues. He didn't design temples. He had one job, one quiet, repetitive, beautiful job. He painted shadows. That's right, just shadows. His entire purpose was to follow the outline of where the sun touched the stone and paint the part it didn't. He traced the light by honoring the dark. But he didn't paint the shadows with meaning or symbol or story. He wasn't there to interpret. He was there to observe, to follow the shadow exactly as it moved along the side of the pyramids, with a steady hand and a silent heart. Every morning he arrived with a pack of brushes, a small pouch of crushed pigment, and nothing else. He worked alone, high on the scaffolding, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. He spoke to no one. He needed no audience. He was not remembered in scrolls or on walls, but some say the shadows he painted still live on the stone, subtle, unnoticed, but there. And tonight, in your dreams, you'll walk beside him. In this story, nothing big will happen. There'll be no action, no loud changes, no emotional twists. He'll simply walk slowly through his quiet world. You'll hear about the way he ground pigment slowly in a stone bowl, the feel of sunlight warming the ladder under his hands, the sound of a soft brush touching ancient stone, the movement of shadows as the sun shifted, slowly, predictably, peacefully. It will all be soft, flat, repetitive. Because that's how sleep happens. Not by excitement, but by boredom, it's by rhythm, by quiet presence. So as I begin this journey, I want you to do one thing. Let go. Let go of your day. Let go of your thoughts. Let go of anything that doesn't belong to this night. You're not here to be productive. You're here to fall, slowly, gently, peacefully, into sleep. And if you don't hear the end of the story, that's perfect. That means your mind has let go completely. That's our goal. That's your reward. So now, close your eyes. Or keep them half open. It doesn't matter. Let your hands be still. Let your chest rise and fall, soft and slow. And come with me to the shadowed side of the pyramids, where the light ends and the silence begins. The morning arrived the same way it always did, quietly, softly, not with a burst of color or energy, but with the slow crawl of light over sand. He was already awake. He always was. The man who painted shadows did not need an alarm, did not dream of rushing. He did not race the sunrise. He waited for it like an old friend, predictable, steady, returning every day just the same, and just in time. He stepped out of his small stone shelter built not far from the Great Pyramid's southern edge. He lived alone, small space, one mat, one blanket, one jar of water, a flat surface, just big enough for mixing pigment. He blinked into the low amber light, his eyes adjusting slowly, not bothered by the glow. He did not stretch, he did not sigh, simply walked, barefoot across the quiet morning sand. His tools were already waiting for him, laid out on a flat square of linen cloth, held down by 4 small river stones. 1 brush, 2 jars, 3 colors. He would not need more than that today. He rarely did. The pyramid's base stood before him, rising slowly into the morning mist, its tip hidden in a pale haze. He approached the stone wall, but not to paint yet. No, he needed to begin with silence, with stillness, with mixing. He sat cross-legged at the edge of the pyramid's shadow. The air was still cool, and the earth beneath him felt solid, but not harsh. It held him gently, a perfect seat. He reached for the first jar, a pale gray powder made from crushed limestone and charcoal. The pigment felt soft between his fingers, though it was made from stone. He scooped a small amount, 1 precise pinch, and let it fall into the shallow dish before him. It made no sound, just a puff of gray dust. Then he reached for the second jar, black ochre, dark as night. He added half as much of this, no more, no less. The final jar held sand-burned rust pigment, a red-gold earth. He'd gathered himself from a far-off canyon during a windless week last year. He'd barely used it, but today he'd let a fingertip of it drop into the bowl. Not to color the shadow, but to soften it. He picked up a smooth, round pestle, a small stone he'd shaped with his own hands years ago. It fit perfectly in his palm. He began to grind, scrape, pause, scrape. The rhythm was slow, almost like breathing. He did not rush. The shadow was patient, so he was too. The pigment slowly turned from dry dust into a fine, chalky paste. Then, using a narrow reed with a hollow core, he poured in a small trickle of water from the goatskin pouch at his side. Just enough to loosen the mix, not enough to thin it. He stirred it gently, slow circles. The water darkened the pigment to a soft coal black, not jet black. That would be too harsh. He was not outlining a shape. He was painting the absence of light. The shadow had no voice. It had no borders. It needed softness. Once the paint reached the right consistency, thick enough to hold, light enough to glide, he let it rest. The paint needed to settle, just like his mind, and so he waited. He rested the brush on a flat stone beside him. He leaned back on his hands, looked at the sky. The pyramid's tip was now fully visible. The sunlight had crept down, 1 stone row at a time, until it began to kiss the edge of the wall near where he sat. That's where he would begin. At the place where shadow gave way to brightness, he stood, brushed the sand from his linen robe, lifted the brush, and dipped it into the bowl. Just once. No swirling, no excess. He held it still, let it drip once, then walked toward the stone. The first line would come next, but not yet. Not until he was sure the light had stopped moving. The sun moved slowly, yes, but the painter moved slower. He held his breath, watched the line of the shadow, curled softly along the wall, bowed slightly downward, not sharp, not broken, just as he had hoped. He crouched down, his knees bent with ease. This was the work his body knew best. And then, just as the breeze slowed and the birds went quiet, and even the pyramid seemed to sigh, he touched the brush to stone. The bristles made no sound. The stroke was short, and long, then short again, following the line the sun had abandoned. Did not make the shadow. He followed it. That was his job. That was all he ever did. And it was more than enough. The pyramid didn't tower. It didn't loom. Didn't try to impress. It simply was unmoved, unchanged. As solid as it had been the day before, and the day before that, and the many, many thousands before those. He stood at its base, the shadow painter, brush in hand, pigment jar tied at his side in a cloth sling. Face soft with dust, eyes half-lidded from the early light. It was time to climb. The scaffolding stretched upward, a simple wooden frame lashed together by thick twine. No nails, no iron, just quiet wood, sun-bleached and aged, holding itself together without complaint. The man reached out and touched the first rung, not fast, not careless. He always began by pressing his palm against the wood to check for splinters. The warmth of the sun had already seeped into the grain. He wrapped his fingers around the first horizontal beam, lifted 1 foot, placed it onto the lowest step. It creaked. Not a loud sound. Not an angry one. Just the soft acknowledgement of weight, like the floor greeting an old friend. Then the other foot, another creak. Then stillness. He didn't move immediately. He always waited between steps to breathe, to listen. The wind shifted slightly. Not enough to cool the air, but just enough to move the linen of his robe against his leg. He looked up. The scaffolding reached perhaps 20 feet. Not high by pyramid standards, but high enough to feel removed from the rest of the world. He preferred it that way. He didn't want to see the other workers in the distance. Didn't want to hear the sounds of carts or chisels. Up there, near the wall, near the sky, there was only him in the shadow. He took the next step, then the next. Each foot lifted slowly, deliberately. The soles of his sandals pressing flat against the aged wood. The rope supports brushed against his side. Sometimes they moved. Sometimes they didn't. But he always touched them. Always traced them with his hand as he climbed. A kind of ritual. One that kept his movements steady. His thoughts even. The wind touched his face again. Just for a moment, he paused. At the 7th rung, he looked over his shoulder, not for safety, but for habit. He glanced at the desert below. It was quiet. Endless. The sand didn't shift. It just waited. He turned his eyes upward again. Pyramid's face curved slightly inward the higher it went. Each layer just a little narrower than the one below. He liked that. It felt like the stone was slowly exhaling the higher it climbed into the sky. He continued upward. Slow, even. No rush. No need for it. A hawk flew overhead, a single dot crossing the pale sky. He didn't look up. He could hear the wings moving. That was enough. His fingers brushed against the joints in the scaffold. Some were smoother than others, some wrapped in double twine. He could feel which ones had shifted in the wind and which had stayed tight. He never needed to fix them. They never broke. Adapted. At the top, he reached the last platform, a flat, narrow plank, barely 2 paces wide. It sat flush against the side of the pyramid like a thought leaning against an idea. He exhaled once, not because he was tired, but because the climb always ended the same way. With stillness, He crouched, placed his paint jar on the wooden surface, pressed a folded cloth beneath it to keep it from tipping. He checked the brush. Still moist, still quiet. The wind here was slightly stronger, but not cold, just more awake. The pyramid's surface in this section was smoother. A recent repair, perhaps, or maybe just less worn. He leaned forward. Not too close. Just enough to see the way the light curved around the edge of the stone. The shadow was long here. Thinner. Less confident. Still waking up. He reached forward. Not with his hand, but with his eyes. Measuring. He didn't measure with numbers. Didn't think in width or span. He measured with breath. He inhaled, held it, and then exhaled, watching how the shadow shifted with the movement of his body. Still good, still true. He dipped the brush, just the tip, into the pigment jar. Let the bristles soak. Let them pause, then lifted. The paint clung, but didn't drip. Perfect. He stepped to the stone, placed one hand gently against the block beside him for balance. He did not want to touch the wall he'd paint on. It needed to remain untouched until the brush greeted it. Crouched again, the brush hovered, not touching, just breathing with him. And then he began, a single stroke, curved slightly. Following the faintest line of shade, the bristles moved silently. Another stroke, and another. Each one with just enough space between them to let the light settle. He wasn't filling a canvas. He was whispering to the wall. The brush moved slower now, not because his hands were tired, but because the pyramid demanded it. Each new inch brought a new curve of shadow. No two were the same, but all of them were quiet. He paused, dipped again, lifted again, painted again. The wind shifted. A small gust. He didn't react. He waited. Always waited when the air moved, because the shadow changed with the wind. Even if only a little, even if only for a second. The painter adjusted, tilted his brush slightly, shifted his weight, made the line match the truth of that moment. That's all the work ever was. Matching the truth of that single moment, and the next, and the next. And above him, the sky stayed blue, the sun stayed warm, and the pyramid, as always, stayed still. The brush hovered just above the surface of the stone. Not moving, not quite ready to touch, but not uncertain either. It was like the moment before a whisper is spoken, before a finger dips into water, before the first grain of sand shifts at the edge of a breeze. The painter waited. Not because he had to, but because he always did. Waiting was part of the work. He stared at the wall. Its surface warmed by sun, its shadow lying quietly along the bottom edge, like a cloth carefully placed, just slightly out of reach of light. The brush bristles trembled gently, though there was no wind now. Only the steady breath of the man who held them. He inhaled, held it, then exhaled, slowly, fully, completely. And with that he touched the brush to the stone. The first stroke was not a line. It was not a shape. It was a suggestion. A gentle impression of something darker laid softly along the margin where light stopped showing itself. The bristles barely pressed against the stone. He did not drag them. He let them glide, float, almost as if they weren't even trying to leave a mark. But the pigment held. It always did. The texture of the stone was soft in some places, rough in others. His hand knew which was which before his fingers told him. He had painted this surface before, many times, in many ways. but never the same shadow, because the light never fell the same way twice. The brush moved again. Another stroke, just beside the first. Not quite touching it, but not far. He left the smallest sliver of bare stone between them, a breath's width, just enough space for silence to live in. Then another, and another. Each stroke curved slightly downward, a natural pull of the light bending around the pyramid's soft, massive edge. He followed it. There was no sound except for the faint, dry contact of the brush meeting stone. No words. No birds. Not even footsteps far below. Even the air seemed to hold its breath as he worked. He dipped the brush again, just once. Let the tip rest in the dark pigment for the time it took to blink once. Then he lifted. Let the extra paint drip. One drop. Onto the folded cloth below the jar. Absorbed instantly. No stain. No mark. Then back to the wall. He crouched lower now, following the shadow line as it descended downward by just a finger's width. He painted beside the first row, one careful stroke at a time, each one exactly like the last, but also slightly different. That was the nature of shadow, so it was the nature of his work. Repetition, with difference. He did not paint to finish, he painted to continue. That was his rhythm, that was his reward. There was no applause, overseer, no deadline. Only the wall, only the brush, only the sun, and the shadow between them. He paused. Not from exhaustion, but to observe. He leaned back, let his hand drop to his side, let the brush tip rest lightly against the side of his thigh. He looked at what he had done. It was not dramatic, not decorative, not bold. It was subtle, gentle, soft. That was how he knew it was correct. The line of shadow he had painted looked almost no different from the one that existed naturally. And that was the goal, to imitate what light refused to show, to preserve the softness of absence, to make silence visible. He stood slowly, bones unbothered by the motion, muscles used to the shift in weight, feet silent on the scaffold boards. He did not stretch. He did not shift his robes. He simply turned and walked to the other end of the platform. The sun had moved slightly, only slightly, but enough that the edge of the pyramid's shadow had begun to tilt, downward and inward at a different angle. A new section. A new curve, but the same process. He crouched again, dipped again, lifted again. The brush moved across the stone. Not faster, not slower, just as it had before. He sometimes imagined that the pyramid could feel it, the brush, the attention, the care. He imagined the ancient stones relaxing beneath his touch, releasing a breath they'd held for centuries, but mostly just painted, quietly again and again. The pigment began to thin slightly. He could tell from the faint difference in texture on the wall. Not a problem, it's just a reminder. He would refill it soon, but not yet. He had a few more strokes in him, and the stone had a few more shadows to give. The wind stirred again, a longer breath this time. It moved across the desert floor, gathered warmth from the sand, and drifted upward toward the platform. It touched his shoulder, passed over the jar, shifted the edge of his robe. He paused, as he always did when the wind came. He turned his face slightly toward the desert, not to look, but to listen. The breeze whispered, then faded. The shadow had moved, but only by a hair's width. He adjusted his angle, tilted the brush, changed his crouch, continued. Stroke, pause, observe. stroke again, each motion slower than the one before. Not from fatigue, but from faith. Faith that stillness mattered, that rhythm mattered, that shadows deserved attention too. The painter continued unseen by all but the stones around him. The pyramid didn't watch, but it accepted. And the sun kept moving, not fast, not slow, just enough. By the end of the third hour, he had covered a full row of blocks, 12 large stones, each with a custom curve of light, each with its own slice of shadow, each with its own line of pigment and silence. He stood again, stretched but gently, blinked at the brightness above. It would be time to rest soon, but only after one more dip of the brush, one more quiet line. He crouched again, and the first stroke of the next section began the same way the first had, with quiet, with breath, with care. The sun had shifted again. You wouldn't notice unless you were watching the way he did. He saw it not in the sky, but in the shadow. The edge, once curved like a gentle stream, had straightened. It pulled closer to the pyramid's base now, hugging the stone like a second skin, no longer falling freely. Now it clung. The painter took this as a sign. It was time to stop, not because he was finished. He would never be finished, but because the light had changed, and the shadow too, and the heat. It was beginning to rise. He stood slowly, not all at once. He did everything in parts. First he straightened his spine, then his knees, then his neck. Each shift deliberate, almost ceremonial. His brush, now dried, was returned to its cloth wrap. Folded, pressed, tied, the pigment jar sealed. With a small round stone, fit perfectly into the mouth of the jar, like it had been made just for that purpose. Perhaps it had. Perhaps he'd shaped it himself years ago on a day like this. He looked once more at the wall. His lines from the morning were almost invisible now. The natural shadow had swallowed them, covered them, but he knew they were there, still clinging to the stone. Just beneath the edge of light, he nodded once, just once, turned. The climb down the scaffold was slower than the climb up, not because he was tired, because descending always required more care. Gravity waited. It always did. Never fought it. It moved with it. Foot by foot, hand by hand. It creaked in the same places it always did. The same rung sighed beneath his weight. The same rope brushed his leg as he turned to descend the final few steps. When his feet touched the sand again, the wind met him. But it wasn't cool anymore. The desert had begun to wake, not loudly. Deserts never wake loudly. But the stillness had thickened, changed. The kind of stillness that tells you nothing will move now. Not the birds, not the trees, for there were none. Not the animals that lived in the stone cracks or beneath the dunes. Everything had paused for heat. Even the sun seemed to lower its voice. It didn't shout. It just glowed. He walked a short distance away from the pyramid's base. Not far, just a few steps. It's a familiar spot beneath a low canvas canopy. It was tied to 4 posts, driven into the sand long ago. It never needed to be replaced. They held firm. This shade was enough, a rectangle of mercy drawn in soft shadow on a canvas of light. He sat, legs crossed, back straight, but not rigid. He unwrapped a small cloth pouch. Inside, a piece of dried fig, a slice of honey-soaked bread, 1/2 of a date. He didn't eat quickly or slowly. He simply chewed, until the bite was gone, then waited, then took another. The bread was soft from the sun, the fig sticky between his fingers. He wiped his hands on a separate cloth, folded that cloth again, tucked it beneath the jar. He drank next, but not much. Water was sacred, not because it was rare, but because it was quiet. He poured just enough into a shallow clay bowl, waited. Let the bowl rest on a stone to cool. He dipped his fingers in first. Let the heat leave his skin and lifted it. Both hands and drank. Slowly, softly, one swallow, then stillness another, then nothing. Around him, the sand had begun to glow. Not brightly, not loudly, just enough to suggest warmth. Beneath every grain, it didn't shimmer. It settled. The painter placed both hands on the ground. The sand was warm. Warmer than his skin, but not unpleasant. He let his palms sink slightly. The grains shifted around his fingers. No resistance, no sound. Just the smallest movement of time continuing. He leaned back on his elbows, faced the sky. There were no clouds, only the white stretch of noon. Rolling over the world with no interest in being noticed, Hawk passed again, silent against the brightness. His wings didn't flap. They held, caught by the air, cradled by the heat. To the painter, this part of the day was not about resting. It was about observing, because in this stillness, the shadows shifted the most. Not quickly, not dramatically, but enough for him to learn something. The same wall, the same light, the same time, but the shadows, they always told a slightly different story, and that was enough to keep him coming back. He picked up a smooth pebble beside him, turned it in his fingers, rolled it across his palm, then set it down again. It's not because it meant something, just because he wanted to feel something cool, something round, something different than sand and brush and wood. Even small shifts have meaning in a day made of stillness. Time passed, but not in minutes. Time passed in the way the shadow curled itself. Along the lower edge of the pyramid, what had once been a long stretch was now a fold. Soon, it would be a corner, then a triangle, then a blanket, but not yet. The painter stood, not quickly, not slowly. Just the way a man stands when he's done thinking but not finished being. He dusted the sand from his robe, lifted the jar, unwrapped the brush. The pigment had settled, like that. Settled pigment always held color better. He stirred it once, watched it fold into itself, then looked to the wall again. The next section was waiting. He walked back toward the scaffold. This time he would paint lower. Stay on the ground for now. The shadow was thicker here, deeper, more confident. It had found its place for the afternoon, and so had he. As the sun slowly dipped beyond the edge of the desert, the painter moved with even greater stillness. The long wall of repetition, he painted without thought. Only rhythm, only breath, only shadow. When his own shadow finally touched that of the pyramid, he blended them in silence, letting their overlap guide his hand. The light faded into soft gray, and the pyramid began to disappear into night. In his stone shelter, the painter laid down, not to dream of art or history, but to simply rest. Outside, the wind calmed, the stars held still, and nothing more was required. His brush was wrapped. His work was done. And in the perfect quiet of that ancient desert night, the world exhaled, and he, like you, surrendered fully to sleep.